Okay, hi guys. So we're back. We're talking about part two of Anderson's private government. Okay. What does private government really mean here? Well, when we think of the government, usually we think of the state. We think of the mayor's office. We think of Governor Cuomo. We think of Donald Trump. We think of the cops. But government, according to Anderson, can take more forms than that. You have a government anywhere you have an institution which is able to, or an organization or some social configuration, which is able to impose rules on people and enforce those rules through sanctions and punishments. So families are governments when or to the extent that parents can impose rules on their children and enforce those rules with punishments through, giving you a timeout or whatever when you're a little kid. Schools are governments. They can tell you what to wear, what classes you have to take, how you have to perform in those classes, and so on. And they enforce those rules with threats. If you don't do what you say you're going to do or what you are told to do, you'll be kicked out of the school or whatever. And most importantly, workplaces are governments. And not only are they governments, they are private governments. Private, not in the sense that they are privately owned, that they're owned by individuals and corporations rather than by collectives of citizens or by the government. No, or by the state rather. They are private in the sense that how the government is run is not the business of the subjects of that government. In other words, how your workplace is run is not really up to the workers, at least to a great extent, and at least at most modern workplaces. Okay. This idea of private government is really useful. On the one hand, we can see that there are, because of the private nature of the government, these governments are going to tend in the direction of violating Anderson's sort of principle of equality. They're going to tend towards these hierarchical relationships, hierarchies where some people have authority, esteem, or standing that other people don't. They're also going to tend or not just tend, they are going to be anti-democratic in nature. So if you think that governments should be democratic, and most of us think that states at least should be democratic and states are governments, then you might think that workplaces should be democratic too. This is I think just like a really powerful and very simple argument. Governments should be democratic, workplaces are governments, so workplaces should be democratic. Okay, but what would that actually mean? What would it actually take to make a workplace more democratic? Well, towards the end of part two, Anderson proposes four strategies, four techniques for making workplaces more democratic. So these are what she calls exit, rule of law, constitutional protections, and voice. So exit would be the ability to leave a contract, leave an employment situation when you want to. So things that tend to place restrictions on when people can leave their employment agreement, leave their employers, will violate this sort of principle of exit. So she gives the example of non-compete agreements. So if you've ever worked for, a McDonald's, for example, your employment contract might require that you not work at Burger King or Wendy's or whatever, not work for their competitors anytime in the future. But what this does is it makes the market for labor less competitive. So it makes the individual employees more dependent on their employers, and also drives down wages for employees. So, guaranteeing a right to exit for workers would mean, for example, limiting non-compete agreements or eliminating them altogether. Um, Maybe also you might think, well, if people depend on their jobs in order to survive, then maybe we need some sort of social safety net or maybe a universal guaranteed basic income that would make it possible to live a halfway decent life in a society, even if you're not employed. Okay, so maybe these would be different ways of promoting people's right to exit. Rule of law. So think about how many decisions your employers make that they don't have to provide any kind of accounting for, and which they're able to sort of make based on their own subjective whims and desires. There's not necessarily anything wrong with that. You don't necessarily need a rule for every situation. Rules are rigid things, and situations can be flexible. You might need to think on your feet rather than appealing to some dusty old rule from the past. Still, if there were rule of law governing, for example, when you could fire a person, what would be the conditions under which it would be okay to fire somebody, or rules governing how employees are evaluated, or how they're promoted, or how their wages are to increase or stay the same or decrease over time. So the more we sort of take this sort of arbitrary, unaccountable decisions of managers sort of out of the hands of those individual managers and place them instead on rules, and hopefully these would be rules that we could somehow all agree to, that will tend to make for a more egalitarian workplace. After all, we think of states where there is no rule of law as dictatorial or whatever. And so, even if the state is undemocratic, we think if there's some basic rule of law, well, they've met some minimum sort of threshold. Okay. Constitutional protections are sort of a variation on this theme. But lastly, she says maybe employees need some sort of voice. They need something which will guarantee sort of that their input into how the business is supposed to run is taken seriously. She talks about unions. She talks a little tiny bit about worker co-ops. But there are all sorts of forms that this can take. You can have situations where managers routinely meet with employees to hear their thoughts, and maybe there are some sort of rules in place that sort of guarantee that the managers follow up on suggestions that employees have made. Maybe employees vote directly on decisions that a firm is going to make. So, for example, if a firm was going to make a new hire in a certain department, maybe the members of that department would vote on that hire. Maybe you'd have a kind of representative democracy where managers aren't hired by owners or by upper management, but managers are elected from among the workers. Okay. Maybe you have a situation where not only is the management of the firm democratized, but the ownership of the firm is democratized. So, or actually, I'll add one last option in the management department. You could have what they call co-determination, which is a matter of law in many European countries, where the board of directors of a company has to have some percentage of members drawn from the ranks of the employees themselves, where employees are represented on the board of directors. Okay. So these are all ways of co-determination is another way of sort of democratizing ownership of, management of a firm. I'm just going to take a little notification off the screen there. Okay. We could also talk about different ways of democratizing ownership. So paying people in stock options, just going full worker co-op and having just a firm completely co-owned by its the people who work there. Those are all options. So, you know, as you go forth in your work lives, you can think about the more or less radical ways of doing this. Some of these involve very, very deep structural changes in the ways that workplaces operate today, you know, things like worker co-ops. Other things involve more superficial, but perhaps somewhat helpful sort of steps you can take, having rules about when employees are going to be fired or promoted, or not using non-compete clauses, which will prevent your workers from getting another job in the industry if they decide to leave your job. Okay. As you go on in your managerial lives, you can think creatively about ways of making your own workplaces more democratic, and hopefully you can use your experiences of work as young people with to sort of bear in mind, you know, just how unpleasant it can be to be subject to the arbitrary or dictatorial or undemocratic or inegalitarian whims of workplace. Okay, very good.